Welcome to English with Zenko Master. Get ready to learn something new today.
My name is Emma Harris, and I'm the only police officer in the small village of Meadowville. It's a quiet place, surrounded by green hills and narrow country roads. Most people here know each other by name, and nothing very exciting usually happens. I didn't mind. I liked the peace, the safety, the feeling that this place belonged to me, and I belonged to it. I had worked here for almost 8 years. I lived alone in a small stone cottage not far from the station. My days were filled with simple tasks, checking on the local shops, talking to the older villagers, and dealing with the usual complaints about noise or lost pets. Most of the time, it felt more like being a helper than a police officer. One summer night, I was alone at the station. It was just past midnight, and I was finishing paperwork with a cup of tea in my hand. The station cat, Millie, was sitting on the desk, purring softly. The windows were open, and the warm air carried the smell of flowers from the garden outside. Suddenly, the phone rang. I picked it up right away, thinking it must be serious. No one calls at this hour unless something is wrong. "Meadowville Police Station," I said. "Officer Harris?" a voice said. I knew it at once. It was Margaret Bell, one of the oldest ladies in the village. She lived near the cemetery and often called me about small things, cats in her garden or teenagers making noise. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice nervous. "But there are lights in the cemetery again. Candles, I think. And voices." "Is it the kids again?" I asked. "Playing with candles and pretending to be witches?" "Maybe," she said, "but it feels different tonight. I don't know. I just got scared." "I'll check it out," I told her. "Try to get some rest." I left Millie on the desk, took my torch, and got into the patrol car. The village was silent as I drove down the road toward the cemetery. The moon was full, and everything looked silver in the soft light. When I arrived, I saw candlelight flickering between the gravestones. I turned off the car and stepped out quietly. As I walked through the gate, I could hear music playing softly and the sound of young voices laughing. "All right," I called, my voice calm but firm. "This is the police. Time to pack up and go home." A few of them jumped, surprised. One girl looked ready to scream, but then she saw me and let out a breath. I recognized most of them, teenagers from the village, bored and looking for something to do. A boy named Ryan, tall with messy hair, stepped forward. "We're not doing anything wrong," he said. "Just hanging out." "It's still a cemetery," I replied. "People come here to visit their families, to remember. It's not a place for parties." One girl, a bit younger, said, "We're just trying to see if the ghost is real." "Which ghost is that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Agnes Crow," she said, her eyes wide. "They say she was a witch and that she still walks around the cemetery at night." I gave a small smile. "I think Agnes deserves her rest like everyone else. Come on now, time to go." They didn't argue. I watched them leave, candles in hand, walking down the hill toward the road. I stayed for a while, making sure they were really gone. Then I walked slowly among the graves, checking for any damage. There was none. Just melted candle wax and the sweet smell of summer flowers. But as I passed the old caretaker's cottage at the edge of the cemetery, something caught my eye. A symbol, 3 stars in a circle, had been painted on the wooden door in yellow. It was fresh, the paint still shining in the moonlight. I frowned. That was new. I tried the door, but it was locked. The building had been empty for years, falling apart slowly in the wind and rain. Birds lived inside it now. Or so I thought. I made a note in my book and decided to keep an eye on it in the coming days. The next afternoon, I was walking through the village when my phone rang. It was Margaret again, but this time she sounded different, panicked. "Officer Harris, it's the gallery! There's been a break-in!" The Meadowville Art Gallery was a small place, nothing fancy, but it was loved by everyone in the village. It sat inside an old manor house, with wooden floors, tiny rooms, and large windows that looked out over the hills. I hadn't visited in months. When I arrived, Margaret was waiting outside. She worked at the gallery part-time and helped with exhibitions. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door and led me inside. "It happened while I was upstairs," she said. "I left the front for only a few minutes. When I came down, the painting was gone." "Which one?" I asked. "Summer. The one with the woman under the tree. It was by Evelyn Moore." I knew the painting. Everyone did. It showed a young woman in a yellow dress, sitting under a tree with the sun behind her. The colors were warm and peaceful. I always thought it felt like a memory, something soft and just out of reach. There was an empty space on the wall where the painting had hung. Nothing else was touched. "Do you have cameras?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. "We couldn't afford them. We never thought something like this would happen." I called the crime scene team, but I knew it would be slow. The city had bigger problems, and a small gallery theft didn't get much attention. Still, we did what we could. We looked for fingerprints, took photos, and asked nearby shop owners if they had seen anything strange. That evening, I sat at my desk staring at a photograph of the painting. There was something about the woman's face. She looked both familiar and far away, like someone I had once known but couldn't remember. I sent the image to the National Art Register and started calling local auction houses. I didn't think I would find anything, but I had to try. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the painting. I found myself staring at the photo even when I should have been doing other things. I began to wonder who the woman was. Was she real? Had Evelyn Moore known her personally? One morning, I visited the gallery again. Margaret was there, sorting papers. "I can't stop thinking about the painting," I told her. "Do you know who the woman was?" Margaret paused. "Her name was Eleanor. She was Evelyn's muse. They were close." I looked at the photo again. "Was she local?" "She lived here years ago," Margaret said. "No one really knows what happened to her. She just disappeared. The mystery deepened, and I knew somehow I had to find out the truth. I returned to the station the next morning with the photograph of Summer in my hand. I placed it gently on my desk before looking out the window at the village road below. A handful of people walked by, greeting me with smiles or nods. It was a beautiful day, but inside I felt unsettled. I could not stop thinking about the woman in the painting. She seemed so peaceful, yet she had vanished. Why would anyone take her? I called the National Art Loss Register and reported the stolen painting. I gave them all the details I had and sent the photograph over email. They told me they would let me know if anything showed up in their databases. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, trying to focus on something else. But it was not possible. That woman, named Eleanor, haunted my thoughts. I decided to visit the gallery again. When I arrived, Margaret greeted me with a tired smile. She was wearing the same blue cardigan, and her hair was pulled back loosely. "I called someone," she said quietly. "The art registry called me back. There have been no matches, but I thought you should know." "Thank you," I replied. "We will keep trying." I took a breath and continued. "Is there an archive? Old letters or photographs about Eleanor?" Margaret nodded and led me upstairs to a small room filled with filing cabinets and boxes. The dust on the surfaces suggested it had not been used in years. With careful hands, she handed me several old black and white photographs of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. It was Eleanor. In one picture, she stood in a garden full of flowers. In another, she wore a straw hat and looked at the camera gently. I also found letters, written in fine, elegant handwriting. One was from Evelyn to Eleanor. "You are the light in my days," it said. "Please write soon." I read a few more. They were personal and full of warmth. Another letter was from someone named Grace Bennett. It read, "I remember the day you laughed with Eleanor under the big oak tree." Grace described how Eleanor's laughter had a gentle brightness, like warm sunshine. I closed my eyes. These letters were everyday words, but they felt important. They were the voice of someone who loved. I looked at Margaret and said quietly, "This is more than a painting. This is a memory." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I will help you any way that I can," she said. I stayed upstairs a while longer, reading more letters and looking at photographs. I felt close to Eleanor, as if she were my friend. Then I noticed one envelope addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Moore, care of Grace Bennett. The date was 1955. I wrote that down in my notebook. That evening, I returned home slowly, driving along the river road where the light was soft and gold. At home, I boiled a kettle and made tea. I stared at the photograph of Eleanor until the water boiled. I felt a strange ache in my chest. It was like missing someone I had never met. The next day, I made a new plan. I needed to find Grace Bennett. I asked Margaret for her last known address. It took some searching in old files, but we found one possibility. She lived on Rose Street, in a cottage that looked neat but old. I wrote the address in my notebook and prepared to visit the following morning. That night, I stopped by the gallery after work to pick up a copy of the photograph of Evening in June. I found Margaret working late, her shoulders tired. I thanked her for the help, closed my folder, and walked out into the quiet street. I pressed the photo between my fingers. The woman sat on a terrace, reading a book with a teapot and cake beside her. She looked peaceful, and I felt again the pull of memory and loss. The following morning, I walked down Rose Street under a soft gray sky. I paused in front of a small cottage. The garden was tidy with wildflowers and a stone path. I knocked gently on the door. After a moment it opened, revealing an older woman with soft white hair and bright eyes. She smiled kindly and welcomed me inside. The living room smelled of old books and fresh tea. Dozens of paintings and sketches lined the walls. On a small table, I saw a teacup with a saucer and crumbs of cake. I felt a tingle of hope. She introduced herself as Grace Bennett and invited me to sit. I explained who I was and why I had come. She listened quietly as I spoke about the paintings and about Eleanor. Her eyes filled with tears. "She was the kindest person I ever knew," Grace whispered. Her voice quavered, but she continued. "Eleanor and Evelyn were in love. They were more than friends. Evelyn painted her because she loved her. And I remember John Carr. He was in art school, too." I leaned forward. "John Carr?" Grace nodded slowly and took a deep breath. He was quiet and serious. He admired Eleanor from afar. More than admiration. It became an obsession. "What happened to him?" I asked. Grace's eyes clouded with memory. "He disappeared after graduation. No one heard from him again. He never talked to me again either." "But you said was, rather than is," I said softly. Grace nodded. "I thought he was gone, but I have seen paintings recently. New paintings. I thought someone in the art world was inspired by him." I swallowed carefully. "You think he is alive?" "There were times," Grace said. "I thought I saw his name in a gallery listing or at an auction, but I was never sure. I thought maybe the memories were working on me." I thanked her and left quietly. Her teacup sat on the table, almost full, and I felt the heaviness of someone remembering too much. Back at the station, I checked my notes. John Carr existed, but records stopped in the 1960s. No one knew where he had gone. I added my visit to Grace to my report. I looked at the photograph of Eleanor again. One curious thought came to me. If Carr was obsessed with Eleanor and still alive, maybe he was trying to collect her images. Maybe that is why someone took the paintings. That night I drove through the countryside, stopping at a telephone box in a little village. I called the gallery to ask who else had access to the archives. Margaret answered tiredly but kindly. She said only a few people knew where the key was. I wrote that down. That meant the suspect might have known the gallery. Someone local, or someone who had been there often. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered something. the caretaker's cottage at the cemetery, the stars painted on the door. I had no proof, but I could not forget them. They looked like a sign. That evening I went back to the cemetery when the moon was bright. The air was still and cool. I walked slowly toward the cottage. The symbol was still there, 3 stars in a circle. I looked up at the dark windows. Part of me feared ghosts. Another part wanted answers. Only memories remain, I said to the night. I stood there, feeling small and deep in a mystery that had begun with a painting and a name, but I knew I was close. I felt closer to Eleanor, closer to understanding what obsession can do, and I was not ready to give up. I drove toward the old house John Carr once lived in early the next morning. It stood at the end of a narrow lane and looked neglected. The garden was wild, and the paint on the front door was worn. I knocked, but there was no answer. Pushing gently, the door opened. Inside, the air smelled musty. I called out, but only silence answered. I walked slowly through the hallway and noticed several empty picture frames leaning against the wall. I followed, the sound of my own footsteps, to a room in the back where a painting stood covered with a cloth. My heart pounded as I pulled the cloth aside. The painting showed Eleanor wearing a red dress, standing near a window with rain outside. She looked sad and beautiful, as if she held a secret in her eyes. I snapped a photo with my phone, careful not to disturb anything. I turned and left quietly, locking the door behind me. Back at the station, I read the message on my phone. My supervisor had arranged for officers to search the house. I spoke with him over the phone and sent him the photo. My hand shook, and I sat down slowly at my desk. I stared at the image of Eleanor in the red dress. Who had painted her? And why place this painting in that empty house? Later, the crime scene team called back with a report. They had found several sketches of Eleanor in that house. On the kitchen table, they had found stacks of drawings. Eleanor sitting by a river, Eleanor in a green dress with a book in her lap, and many more. All were drawn with care and longing. The evidence made it clear that someone had spent years remembering her through art. That night, I decided to return to the cemetery. The moon was high and bright, casting cold light over the gravestones. I walked toward the caretaker's cottage and stopped in front of the door. The yellow symbol with 3 stars in a circle was still there. I recognized one of the sketches from John's house had that same symbol drawn in one corner. It felt like a message. I whispered, "I see you." I pressed my hand gently against the wood and felt warmth beneath my palm. Something inside me gave me hope. By morning, the search warrant had been granted for the cottage. I gathered officers and we approached it together. We entered carefully and found a small room piled with paintings, letters, and memories. In the center sat an elderly woman. Her hair was silver gray, her face gentle, and her eyes flooded with confusion and recognition. She looked at me and said softly, "They painted me in the sunlight." I said, I am Emma Harris. You are not alone." She nodded and placed her hand over her heart. She was Eleanor. She had lived all these years in the cottage, forgotten by most, but remembered deeply by someone in paintings. Doctors later told me she had memory loss, but she remembered the feeling of being loved, the warmth of the sun, the color of her dress. My heart ached with both sadness and relief. When she was stable, I arranged a return to the gallery with her. Margaret was waiting. I guided Eleanor into the room where Summer had once hung. Watching her eyes light up, I realized this was homecoming. She touched the familiar place gently and whispered, "I feel it again." I helped her place a hand on the frame. Tears came to my eyes. We organized a small exhibit to honor Eleanor and Evelyn's story, an exhibit called Eleanor's Light. We placed summer and evening in June side by side. Below them, we displayed the painting in red and some sketches from the house. We typed a note explaining who created each and how they had been lost and found. The gallery opened for a viewing full of quiet wonder. I watched as visitors stood with their hands over their hearts, recognizing beauty, loss, and love. Many read the letters written by Evelyn and Grace aloud. In soft voices, they spoke of sunshine, laughter in gardens, and long-lost memories. One afternoon, as visitors came and went, I stood near the entrance. Eleanor entered the room slowly, leaning on a cane. Margaret helped her walk between the paintings. She paused in front of each one, her eyes alight. She whispered, "This is me. This is how I was loved." Her voice trembled with recognition. I felt proud and grateful. The obsession that had stolen the paintings had also preserved memory. The man who loved her more than circumstances had painted her when he could. I thought of John Carr. He must have been lost to grief, turning to art for comfort. He painted his love, and when he could no longer keep her, the paintings became her path back. In the fading afternoon light, I sat with Eleanor on a bench in the gallery garden. The sky was pink and calm. She reached out and touched my hand softly. I squeezed hers and said softly, "I'm glad you are home." She nodded and leaned forward, resting her head gently beside me. In that moment, I understood the power of memory, art, and kindness. I knew that stories matter, that love can outlive time, even memories, that a police officer's heart, when guided by empathy, can help carry someone from darkness into light. I thought of the road ahead and felt peaceful. Eleanor was safe, and that was enough.